The castle was early quiet that morning, a thin veil of mist clinging to the stone courtyard, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no drops had yet fallen, and the sun was barely rising over the eastern hills. Wine tightened her cloak around her shoulders, the chill of dawn sinking into her bones. She stood just beyond the grand archway, watching servants scurry about with pails of water and bundles of firewood. She had been called there before sunrise, and no one had told her why. Not until now. The head steward, a thin, severe man named Cedric, approached her with a look that made her spine straighten. He always looked as if he had swallowed a lemon, but this morning his expression was even more pinched. Wine, he said briskly, barely sparing her a glance as he came up. You have been reassigned. Her heart skipped. Reassigned? She had been working as a healer apprentice for nearly 3 years now. She spent most of her days tending to servants who burned themselves cooking, knights who returned from training with bruised ribs, and the occasional villager who dared to seek help from the castle infirmary. It wasn't glamorous, but it was good work, work that mattered. She nodded, masking her unease. Reassigned to where? Cedric's lips twitched, almost as if he had found some grim amusement in what he was about to say. To the royal wing. Wine blinked. The royal wing? Yes, his tone left no room for argument. You will be the personal caretaker to Prince Jungkook. The name landed between them like a stone. Prince Jungkook, the only son of King Jeon and Queen Zera, the heir to the throne, the one they had called Storm Prince behind closed door. One had never met him personally, but she had heard the rumors everyone in the castle had. Prince Jungkook was said to have a temper that could make grown men tremble. He had been known to throw goblets across rooms, snap swords in half during training, and once, if his whispers were true, punch a visiting lord's son for looking at him in the wrong way. He was a man both feared and pitied. Why me? She asked carefully. Cedric gave her a long, assessing look. Because you have a reputation for patience, because you do not scare easily, and because no one else would take the post. There it was. This is not optional wine, he added, his voice softening only slightly. The prince has been difficult of late. His injury is healing poorly, and if he is to be ready for the autumn council meetings, he will need constant supervision. You are to ensure he eats, rests, and does not injure himself further during training. You are to report any incidents. Incidents? That word sat heavy in her stomach. I understand, she said finally, though she wasn't sure she did. Cedric's gaze softened for a fleeting second, so brief she might have imagined it. Then you would best get moving. He does not like to be kept waiting. The royal wing was unlike anything Wine had ever seen. She had been inside the castle's great hall and its kitchens, but this place felt like an entirely different world. The corridors were lined with deep red carpets, the walls hung with gilded paintings of past monarchs, staring down with judging eyes. Suites of armor stood guard at every corner, gleaming in the morning light. A maid led her down the hallway, her eyes wide and anxious. He's in a foul mood today, the girl whispered as they approached the Prince Chamber's door. Broke a chair last night. Wine's brows rose. A chair? The maid nodded vigorously. Snapped it clean in half. Be careful. The girl cut quickly and scurried away, leaving Wine alone before the heavy double doors. She drew in a slow, steady breath. Whatever waited for her inside, she would handle it. She always did. She knocked. For a moment there was silence. Then a voice, low, rough, and impatient, called, "Enter." Wine pushed the door open. The room was spacious but in disarray. A chair lay topped near the fireplace, and a half empty glass of wine sat abandoned on a table. The curtains were drawn, casting the room into shadows, and there, standing near the window, was Prince Jungkook. He was taller than she expected, broad shouldered with dark hair falling messily into storm grey eyes. His tunic was half laced, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms, crisscrossed with scars. A bandage was wrapped around his left hand, already stained with blood. He turned as she entered, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You are not Cedric," he said flatly. "No," she replied evenly. "I'm Vine. I'm assigned as your caretaker." His brow furrowed, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "Caretaker?" "Yes." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here to make sure you don't tear your stitches open again." He barked out a laugh, humorless, a sharp. "So they have sent me a babysitter." Wine didn't rise to the bite, if that's what you want to call me. For a moment they just stared at each other, two storms waiting to see which would break first. Then Jungkook turned away, striding back toward the window. "I don't need anyone watching me," he said, his voice clipped. "I think your hand disagrees," she said lightly, nodding toward the blood seeping through the bandage. He glanced down at it, scowling as if the wound had personally betrayed him. Wine set her satchel down on the table and began pulling out fresh linen and salve. "Sit," she said firmly. He looked at her over his shoulder, his expression somewhere between surprise and irritation. "Excuse me?" "You're bleeding," she said unfazed. "Either you sit or I will chase you around this room until you do. Your choice." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, to her surprise, Jungkook actually smirked, just barely. He crossed the room slowly and dropped into the chair by the table, watching her with a look she couldn't quite read. Wine knelt beside him, carefully unwrapping the soiled bandage. His hand was strong and calloused, the skin around the stitches raw and inflamed. She worked in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. "You're not afraid of me?" he said suddenly, his voice quieter now. "Should I be?" she asked without looking up. Most people flinched when he spoke like that. Most people tiptoed around him, afraid of his temper, but not her. Jungkook studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in the chair. "Maybe," he said finally. Wine finished rewrapping his hand and tied the bandage neatly. "There," she said, standing. "Try not to destroy it this time." A half of laughter escaped him, the closest thing to amusement she had heard from him yet. "You are either very brave," he said, tilting his head, "or very stupid." Wine smiled faintly. "I have been called both." The first week was a trial by fire. Wine had never met anyone quite like Prince Jungkook. He was infuriating. One moment he would be quiet, brooding by the window with that faraway look in his eyes, as if the world outside the castle walls was calling to him. The next he would be snapping at her over the smallest thing, his temper flaring like a sudden summer storm. By the third day, she had already lost count of how many times he had thrown something across the room. On the morning of the fifth day, she found him pacing like a caged wolf, his hair drawn with sweat and his jaw set. "You tore it again, didn't you?" she said without preamble, setting her satchel down. Jungkook didn't look at her. "It's fine." She crossed the room and caught his wrist before he could shove it behind his back. "It is not fine," she said sharply. The bandage was soaked with blood. Jungkook yanked his arm away, his eyes flashing. "Do not touch me." Wine's eyes met his glare evenly, refusing to back down. Then stop behaving like a child and sit. That earned her a snarl. Most people would have fluttered the look. The sharp edge of his temper was almost tangible, but Wine stayed right there where she was. You think you can order me around? Jungkook asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I think someone has to keep you from destroying yourself. She shot back. His hand twitched at his side, as if he were fighting the urge to throw something. For a moment she thought he might actually yell, but instead he turned abruptly and stalked toward the chair, dropping into it with all the grace of a thundercloud. Make it quick, he said. Wine knelt and began working. His skin was hot beneath her fingers from fever or fury. She couldn't tell. You are lucky the stitches held, she murmured, cleaning the wound carefully. What were you doing? Training? Training? She looked up at him. You can barely grip a sword. I have to be ready. Jungkook's jaw tightened. For what? His gaze flickered to the window. For everything. Wine didn't press, not yet. But she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the restless way his leg bounced, as if he couldn't stand standing still. It wasn't just his temper that made Jungkook difficult, it was his silence. He kept his thoughts locked away behind guarded expressions and short answers, but Wine was nothing if not patient. She began to notice things. The way he would wake in the middle of the night, breathing hard, sweat soaking his tunic. The way his hand curled into a fist when he looked at the training yard from the window. The way his temper was sharpest in the mornings. Once, when she entered without knocking, she found him standing shirtless before the mirror, his back to her, scars crisscrossed his skin, some thin and pale, others newer, angrier. He turned quickly, grabbing his shirt and pulling it on, his expression dark. Get out, he said roughly. I was only. I said get out. Wine hesitated, then backed out of the room. But that night she left a jar of salt by his bedside. She didn't say a word about it by the next day, and neither did he. But she noticed it was empty a week later. By the second week, they had fallen into a strange rhythm. Wine would change his bandages, make sure he ate, and drag him into the courtyard for fresh air. Jungkook would scowl and resist at every turn, but he always complied eventually. One afternoon, as she sat near the fireplace stitching a tear in his tunic, Jungkook spoke. You don't ask questions, he said. Wine glanced up. Should I? Most people do. They want to know why I am the way I am. She threaded the needle carefully. Would you answer if I asked? Jungkook's lips twisted. No. Then what is the point? That earned her the faintest ghost of a smile. You are different, he said after a long moment. Wine set the tunic aside. Different? How? You don't treat me like I'm dangerous, aren't you? She asked softly. His eyes met hers across the firelight. Yes. The air between them seemed to thumb for a moment, tense, electric. Then Jungkook looked away, his jaw working. 2 days later, the storm finally broke. It started with a knock on the door. Cedric entered, his face pale. Your Highness, he said, bowing. Your father requests your presence in the council chamber. Jungkook's entire body went still. I'm not attending, he said flatly. Cedric hesitated. Sir, the king insisted. I said no. The shout was so sharp it made candles flicker. Cedric blanched and backed toward the door. Jungkook grabbed the goblet from the table and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, wine spattering like blood. Wine stood frozen for a moment, then moved toward him carefully. Jungkook, leave, he snarled, his voice raw. She didn't. Instead, she stepped closer, placing herself between him and the next thing he might throw. Talk to me, she said quietly. His chest was heaving, his hands clenched into fists. You do not understand. Then make me. For a long doubt moment, she thought he might actually push her out of the way. But then something in his expression cracked. They want me to sit in that chamber, he said, his voice low and rough, and pretend everything is fine. Pretend that I am fine. But I can't. I can't sit there and listen to them talk about the future of this kingdom when I can't even hold a sword without tearing my hand open. His voice broke on the last word, and for the first time, Vine saw something other than anger in his eyes. She saw fear. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, the injured one. Jungkook stared at her as if startled by the touch. You will hold a sword again, she said firmly, but not if you destroy yourself first. His throat worked as he swallowed. For a moment, they just stood there, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then Jungkook exhaled and let himself sink into the chair. Wine stayed beside him until his breathing slowed. The rain came 2 days later, a heavy rainless storm that lashed against the castle walls and turned the courtyard into a sea of mud. The entire castle seemed to hunker down against the wind torches hissed in the corridors, and servants moved quickly, as if afraid the storm might swallow them too. Django had been pacing since dawn. Wine watched him from her place near the fire, mending forgotten in her lap. He moved like a restless predator, his jaw clenched, his injured hand clenched and unclenched at his side. You're going to wear a hole in the floor, she said finally. Jungkook stopped, his storm grey eyes snapping to hers. Do you have any idea how many things are wrong with this kingdom? He asked, his voice low, sharp. Wine asked a bro, I'm sure you'll tell. Bandits on the eastern border, merchants complaining of shortages, lords whispering about whether I am fit to inherit. The lord's words were spat like poison. Wine set her work aside and stood, crossing the room. You can't control what they say, she said gently. Jungkook turned on her so quickly she almost stumbled. You think I don't know that? He snapped. You think I don't hear them? Every time I walk into that council chamber, I see it on their faces. The doubt, the pity. They think I'm weak. They think I'm broken. His voice rose with each word until it was nearly a shout. Wine didn't flinch. You're not broken, she said quietly. Jungkook's chest heaved. For a moment, he just stared at her, rain hammering against the windows like a drumbeat. Then he turned abruptly, grabbing the chair nearest the fire and hurling it across the room. It crashed against the wall, splintering into pieces. The sound was loud enough to make the torches flicker. Wine stood her ground, her pulse quickening not from fear but from the sheer force of him. Feel better? She asked dryly. Jungkook whipped around to face her, his eyes blazing, and then to her utter shock, he laughed. It was a dark, rough sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. They stood there for a long moment, staring at each other across the wreckage of the chair, until Jungkook's expression softened just slightly. You really don't fear me, do you? He asked. No, she said simply. Jungkook's lips curved into. It was quite a smile, but wasn't a scar. Later that night, Vine found herself unable to sleep. The storm still raged outside, and the castle creaked with the wind. Something drew her back to Jungkook's chamber. She hesitated at the door before knocking softly. Come in, he said. When she entered, she found him sitting on the floor near the window, his back against the wall, a bottle of wine beside him. You are awake, she said, closing the door behind her. So are you, he replied, gesturing to her to say. Wine hesitated, then crossed the room and lowered herself beside him. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the rain. Do you know how I got this? Jungkook asked suddenly, holding up his injured hand. Wine glanced at him. I assumed it was from training. Jungkook's jaw tightened. Not exactly. He took a long swig from the bottle before speaking again. There was an ambush, he said finally, his voice low. 2 months ago, I was leading a patrol near the border when we were attacked. I managed to fight them off, but one of them had a blade coated with poison. I got it. But he trailed off, flexing his hands as if the memory were still lodged in his bones. The healer saved my life, he went on. But as they said, I might never grip a sword the same way again. Wine's chest tightened. No wonder you're angry, she said softly. Jungkook turned his head to look at her. I'm angry because I should have seen it coming, he said, his voice harsh. I was careless. My men nearly died because of me. You blame yourself, she said. I'm responsible. He snapped. Yes, she agreed calmly. But responsibility doesn't mean destroying yourself over something you can't change. Jungkook stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he essayed. You sound like my mother, he muttered. Smart woman, your mother, she said with a faint smile. That earned her a quiet huff of laughter. It became a habit after that, these late night conversations. Jungkook would sit by the window and Wine would join him, the two of them talking in hushed voices while the castle slept. Sometimes he spoke of the kingdom, of the burdens waiting for him when he took the throne. Sometimes he said nothing at all, simply sitting beside her as if her presence alone kept the storm at bay. One night, after a particularly long silence, Jungkook spoke. You're not what I expected, he said. Wine tilted her head. What did you expect? Someone who would tiptoe around me? He admitted. Someone who would look at me like I was a monster. Wine's lips curled. You're not a monster, Jungkook. His gaze found hers, something flickering in his storm grey eyes. Some days I'm not so sure, he said quietly. Before she could respond, a loud crack of thunder shook the castle instinctively. Wine flinched, Jungkook noticed. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture, warm, grounding, but it made Wine's breath catch. For a moment they just sat there, their hands clasped, the storms raging around them. And for the first time since she had arrived, Jungkook looked almost at peace. The next morning when Wine returned to change his bandages, Jungkook didn't scowl or snap. Instead he offered her a chair, and when their hands brushed hers, she tied the fresh linen. Neither of them moved away. The walls between them were cracking, and Wine had a feeling that once they broke completely, there would be no turning back. The day Jungkook finally stepped into the council chamber, the castle seemed to hold its breath. Wine could feel the tension radiating off him from the moment she entered his chambers that morning. He stood before the mirror, his tunic half laced, his jaw tight as she wrapped his freshly cleaned bandages. You don't have to go if you're not ready, she said quietly. Jungkook's gaze met hers in the mirror. If I wait until I'm ready, he said, his voice low, I never go back at all. There was no arguing with that. She fastened the last tie and stepped back. Then hold your head high and make them remember you are their prince, not their pity. A flicker of something amusement maybe crossed his face. You speak as though you have been in my place. No, she said simply, but I have seen enough men brought to their knees by fear to know that standing is always the first battle. That earned her a small sharp nod. The council chamber was grand as Wine had imagined, a circular room with high arched windows and banners hanging between them. A massive table stood in the center, surrounded by chairs where lords and advisers were already gathered. The room went silent when Jungkook entered. Wine stayed just behind them, her presence unobtrusive. but steady. Some of the lords bowed their heads respectfully, others, the ones who had whispered doubts about his fitness to rule, merely watched, their eyes calculating. Jungkook walked to the head of the table, his posture proud despite the slight stiffness in his movements. "Shall we begin?" he said, his voice carrying clearly. For a mobile, the meeting went as expected. Talk of supply routes, of disputes between neighboring villages, of trade agreements, and then Lord Garen spoke. "With all due respect, Your Highness," Garen said, his tone smooth but edged, "these are not decisions to be made hastily. The kingdom needs a ruler who is fully capable. Perhaps it would be wise to delay certain matters until you are." "Until I am what?" Jingo cut in, his voice sharp enough to make the man flinch. "War again?" A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the room. "Forgive me, sir," Karen said, bowing slightly. "I only meant I know exactly what you meant." Jungkook's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the goblets. "You think I'm unfit. You think I'm too broken to lead." Jungkook, one of the older counselors, began gently, but the prince was already standing. His shoulders taut, his breathing harsh. One could feel the anger rolling off him like waves, could see the storm building in his eyes. If she didn't step in now, this would end badly, quietly, firmly. She touched his arm. "Jungkook," she said, just loud enough for him to hear. He turned his head, and for a heartbeat Wine thought he might shake off her. But when his gaze locked on hers and something shifted, his jaw clenched, his chest still heaving, but slowly he sank back into his chair. "Continue," he said coldly. The counselor cleared his throat and launched into the next topic, though the tension in the room remained as thick as smoke. Wine kept her hand on Jungkook's arm until his breathing steadied. After the meeting, Jungkook strode from the chamber without a word, Wine hurrying to keep up. When they reached the privacy of his chambers, he stopped abruptly, bracing his hands against the wall. "Damn them," he muttered. "Damn them all." "They were biting you," she said softly. "I know," Jungkook bit out, "and I nearly gave them what they wanted." She stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on his back. "But you didn't." Jungkook turned, his storm grey eyes searching hers. "You stopped me," he said quietly. "I reminded you who you are," he corrected. For a moment, they just stood there, the space between them charged. Then Jungkook's hand came up, brushing her cheek, tentative, almost questioning. Wine's breath caught, but she didn't move away. "You are the only one who can do that," he said, his voice rough. Her heart thudded in her chest. "I'm not here to tame you, Jungkook," she whispered. "I'm here to make sure you don't lose yourself." His thumb traced the line of her jaw before he dropped his hand and stepped back. "Then don't leave," he said.